August 17, 1943, 28,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Bandits 12 o'clock high, multiple fighters inbound. The radio crackles with urgency. Major John, Rosie, Rosenthal watches through the windscreen of his B-17 as black dots materialize into FW-190s, diving straight at his formation. But his bombers aren't arranged like any formation command has ever seen. They're staggered in a pattern that shouldn't exist. A pattern that violates every tactical manual the 8th Air Force has published. Ground control erupts. Rosie read leader, what is that formation? Who authorized this? Rosenthal doesn't answer. He can't. Because in the next 11 minutes, his illegal pattern will face 19 separate fighter attacks, and not a single bomber in his group will go down. 3 hours later, when he lands at Thorpe Abbott's, a colonel is waiting on the tarmac. His face is red with fury. Rosenthal is about to be court-martialed. Or so everyone thinks. By the summer of 1943, the United States Army Air Forces faced a tactical crisis that was bleeding the 8th Air Force white over Europe. The numbers were catastrophic. In the first 7 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 188 heavy bombers over Germany, nearly 2,000 trained aircrewmen killed, missing, or captured. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids alone would cost 60 B-17s in a single day. At current loss rates, entire bomb groups were being destroyed every month. Some squadrons lost more aircraft than they had received as original equipment. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of engineering. The problem wasn't the crews. American airmen were among the best trained in the world. The problem was doctrine. Specifically, the tactical formations the bombers flew were getting them killed. The official formation, designated combat box formation in Air Force tactical manuals, had been designed by staff officers at 8th Air Force headquarters. It looked perfect on paper. Bombers arranged in precise geometric patterns, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire that should theoretically shred any attacking fighter. The formation had been tested, approved, analyzed, and mandated for all combat operations. But combat isn't theoretical, and the Germans weren't following the script. Luftwaffe fighter pilots had spent months studying American formations. They'd identified the weak points, the blind spots, the angles of attack where defensive fire was lightest. They developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the combat box's vulnerabilities. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high, where the B-17's nose guns were weakest. Diving attacks from 6 o'clock high, exploiting vertical blind spots. Coordinated beam attacks that split formations apart. The result was slaughter. Groups flying the official combat box were being torn to pieces. Bomber crews called it the coffin formation. Some units had casualty rates exceeding 30% per mission. The statistical probability of surviving a 25-mission tour was dropping below 25%. 8th Air Force Command knew they had a problem, but military bureaucracy moves slowly. There were committees, studies, tactical reviews. Changes to official doctrine required approval from multiple levels of command, extensive testing, formal documentation. The crews didn't have time for committees. They were dying now. What happened next shocked everyone, because the solution didn't come from headquarters or tactical planners. It came from a 26-year-old major who decided that saving his men was more important than following regulations. His name was John Rosenthal, and he was about to commit an act of tactical heresy that would either save hundreds of lives or end his career. This is that story. To understand why Rosenthal risked court-martial, we need to go back to June 1943, when the inadequacy of standard bomber formations became undeniably clear. The combat box formation that 8th Air Force headquarters mandated was based on sound defensive principles, in theory. 18 to 21 bombers arranged in three-tiered defensive boxes with lead, high, and low squadrons. Each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The formation was tight, disciplined, and looked impressive during training flights over England. But it had fatal flaws that only revealed themselves under actual combat conditions. First, the tight spacing, designed to maximize defensive firepower, made the entire formation vulnerable to flak. A single well-placed 88 burst could damage multiple aircraft. Worse, the rigid positioning limited evasive maneuvering. Bombers had to hold formation regardless of flak or fighter attacks, making them predictable targets. Second, the geometric precision that looked good on paper created exploitable blind spots. The forward low quadrant was particularly vulnerable. German fighters attacking from 11 o'clock low had only the lead aircraft's nose guns to contend with. The chin turret that would later address this weakness hadn't yet been installed on most B-17Fs flying in mid-1943. Third, and most critically, the combat box assumed disciplined formation flying under fire. But when a bomber took damage, when an engine failed, when a pilot was wounded, aircraft fell out of position. And the moment a bomber left the protective geometry of the combat box, it became a straggler, easy prey for German fighters who could attack from any angle without facing concentrated defensive fire. The June 13, 1943 mission to Bremen demonstrated these flaws with brutal clarity. The 100th Bomb Group, flying textbook combat box formations, lost 9 aircraft out of 21 dispatched, a 43% loss rate. Post-mission analysis showed that 7 of those 9 bombers were shot down after taking initial damage that forced them out of formation. The combat box protected aircraft that maintained position, but it offered no flexibility for damaged aircraft, no contingency for the chaos of actual combat. Field commanders began requesting permission to modify the formation. Headquarters denied most requests. Tactical doctrine was set at command level, not in the field. Unauthorized formation changes were explicitly forbidden. Any group commander who deviated from approved tactics without authorization risked relief of command. But the solution would come from an unexpected place. A young major who believed regulations were less important than bringing his men home alive. Enter Major John Rosie Rosenthal, a name that would become legendary in the 100th Bomb Group, though for reasons command never anticipated. Rosenthal wasn't a career military officer. He was a lawyer from Brooklyn, New York, who'd volunteered for the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor. At 26 years old, he was younger than many of the men he commanded. He'd earned his nickname not from his disposition. Rosenthal was known as serious and intense, but from the play on his surname and the popular song, Rosie the Riveter. What set Rosenthal apart wasn't flying skill or tactical training. It was his approach to problems. As a lawyer, he'd been trained to question assumptions, to look for weaknesses in arguments, to find solutions others missed. He applied that same analytical mindset to military doctrine. Rosenthal arrived at Thorpe Abbotts in May 1943 and immediately began observing how formations performed under combat conditions. He didn't just fly his missions and debrief. He interviewed every pilot and gunner who returned. He examined gun camera footage. He studied German fighter tactics. He mapped out attack patterns and defensive fire zones. What he discovered disturbed him. The combat box formation was designed by staff officers who understood geometry and fields of fire, but had never faced a coordinated Luftwaffe fighter attack. The formation assumed attacks would come from predictable angles. It assumed perfect discipline under fire. It assumed conditions that didn't exist in actual combat. Rosenthal began sketching alternative formations in his quarters at night. He calculated firing arcs, measured blind spots, considered how bombers could support each other while maintaining enough spacing to avoid flak damage concentration. He studied historical naval formations from the Age of Sail, how warships had arranged themselves for mutual defense while maintaining maneuverability. His executive officer, Captain John Brady, discovered him one night surrounded by papers covered in formation diagrams. "Rosie, what are you doing?" Rosenthal looked up, "Finding a way to keep us alive. You know, modifying the combat box without authorization is against regulations, I know." Rosenthal tapped one of his diagrams. "So is watching my men die following formations that don't work." Brady studied the sketches. What he saw was radical. Bombers staggered in depth, with wider lateral spacing but tighter vertical integration. The pattern looked chaotic compared to the geometric precision of the combat box. But as Brady traced the defensive firing arcs, he realized something. This formation had no major blind spots. Fighters attacking from any angle would face concentrated fire from multiple aircraft. "This is brilliant," Brady said quietly. "It's also completely unauthorized." "I know. Command will crucify you." "Probably," Rosenthal gathered his sketches. "But if it works, if it saves even one crew, it's worth it." Over the next 2 weeks, Rosenthal refined his formation during training flights, claiming he was practicing formation discipline. What he was actually doing was teaching his pilots a completely new tactical arrangement, one that headquarters had never approved, one that technically violated standing orders. However, what happened during the first test flight would shock everyone involved, because Rosenthal was about to put his career on the line. What made Rosenthal's formation illegal wasn't just that it was unauthorized. It violated the fundamental principles that 8th Air Force tactical doctrine was built on. The official combat box emphasized tight geometric precision. Aircraft flew in rigid positions relative to the lead bomber. The formation maintained specific altitude separations. Lead squadron at base altitude, high squadron 500 feet above, low squadron 500 feet below. Lateral spacing was minimized to maximize overlapping fields of fire. Rosenthal's formation threw all of that out. Instead of tight geometric boxes, his aircraft flew in a staggered depth arrangement he called the Javelin Formation. The name came from its appearance. From above, the group resembled a javelin or arrow point, with aircraft staggered both horizontally and vertically in an asymmetric pattern that seemed random but was precisely calculated. The key innovations were radical for 1943. First, increased lateral spacing. Aircraft flew 50 to 75 feet further apart than combat box doctrine specified. This reduced vulnerability to flak and gave pilots more room to maneuver without breaking formation. Critics argued this would create gaps in defensive coverage. Rosenthal's calculations showed it actually improved firing arcs by reducing the chance of friendly aircraft blocking gunners' fields of fire. Second, staggered depth positioning. Instead of neat horizontal lines, aircraft were positioned at varying distances from the formation center, creating a three-dimensional defensive matrix. Attackers couldn't predict where the next bomber would be, making it harder to line up attacks on multiple targets. Third, dynamic positioning. The Javelin Formation included flex points, where aircraft could adjust position during combat without breaking the formation's defensive integrity. If a bomber took damage, nearby aircraft could shift to cover the gaps while the damaged bomber recovered or fell back to a protected position. Most controversially, Rosenthal's formation abandoned the rigid lead-high-low squadron structure. Instead, aircraft were assigned defensive roles based on their position in the formation geometry, not their squadron designation. This cross-squadron integration was explicitly forbidden by 8th Air Force doctrine, which mandated that squadrons maintain unit integrity. On paper, the Javelin Formation looked like chaos. It violated spacing regulations, squadron integrity requirements, and geometric precision standards. Any staff officer reviewing it would immediately flag it as unauthorized and dangerous. But Rosenthal wasn't interested in what staff officers thought. He was interested in whether it would survive 19 fighter attacks without losing a single bomber. He was about to find out, because on August 17, 1943, his group was assigned to the most dangerous mission yet attempted. August 17, 1943, the Schweinfurt mission, a double strike deep into Germany that would become known as Black Thursday. The mission briefing at 400 hours outlined the nightmare. 376 bombers would strike ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg. The target was 300 miles inside Germany. Fighter escort would only cover the first 100 miles. After that, the bombers would be on their own for over 4 hours of flight time, 2 hours in, 2 hours out, running a gauntlet of German fighters that would have time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack again. Expected losses, 30 to 40 aircraft, acceptable losses per 8th Air Force Command. Rosenthal sat in the briefing and did the math. 40 bombers meant 400 dead or captured airmen. His group was flying 21 aircraft as part of the Regensburg force. Statistical probability said 6 or 7 wouldn't come home. After the briefing, Rosenthal gathered his pilots. "We're flying Javelin Formation today." The room went silent. Captain Brady spoke first. "Rosie, that's not authorized if command finds out." "Command is 200 miles away," Rosenthal cut him off. "The Luftwaffe is going to be right in front of us. I'd rather face a court-martial than write letters to 20 families." Lieutenant Robert Hughes raised his hand. "Sir, we've only practiced this twice. What if it doesn't work?" Rosenthal met his eyes. Then I was wrong and I'll take full responsibility. But if the combat box doesn't work, and we know it doesn't, then following regulations just means we die according to the book. At 8:30 hours, the 100th Bomb Group formed up over the English Channel. The other groups assembled in standard combat box formations. Rosenthal's group looked different, looser, asymmetric, almost disorganized to outside observers. The group commander from the 390th Bomb Group radioed. "Rosie, Red Leader, check your formation. You're out of spec." Rosenthal keyed his mic. "Formation is nominal, proceeding as briefed." It was a lie. The formation was anything but as briefed. But by the time anyone at headquarters realized what he'd done, they'd be over Germany. Too late to abort, too late to do anything but finish the mission. As they crossed the Dutch coast and the fighter escort turned back, Rosenthal knew there was no turning back either. In the next few hours, his career would either be over, or his illegal formation would prove itself in the most brutal test imaginable. Stay with me because this next part is crucial. The first indication that something was wrong came at 8:47 hours, when a staff officer at 8th Air Force Headquarters was reviewing formation photographs taken by reconnaissance aircraft during assembly. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson stared at the photo showing the 100th Bomb Group's formation. He grabbed his phone. "Get me the duty officer at Thorpe Abbotts, now." But the 100th was already over the North Sea, radio silence in effect, too far gone to recall. Wilson immediately called the operations center. "The 100th Bomb Group is flying an unauthorized formation. Who approved this?" "Sir, their flight plan shows standard combat box." "I don't care what the flight plan shows. Look at these photos. That is not combat box. I don't even know what that is." Wilson pulled the 100th's personnel files. Group Commander, Colonel Harold Huglin. But Huglin wasn't flying today's mission. He'd been grounded with a sinus infection. The acting commander was Major John Rosenthal. Wilson found Rosenthal's file. Young, relatively inexperienced. No tactical training beyond standard bomber school. And now flying 21 B-17s worth $6 million in an unauthorized formation on the deepest penetration mission yet attempted. "Get Colonel Curtis LeMay on the line." When LeMay, commander of the 3rd Bomb Division, saw the photographs, his response was immediate and volcanic. "Who the hell authorized this cowboy to redesign Air Force tactical doctrine? Where's Huglin?" "Grounded, sir, medical." "Then who's in command?" "Major Rosenthal, sir." LeMay slammed his hand on the desk. "A major, a goddamn major decided he knows better than Air Force Command." He picked up the phone. "Get me Thorpe Abbotts. I want Rosenthal's ass in front of a court-martial board the second he lands, if he lands." The operations officer hesitated. "Sir, they're already over enemy territory if the formation fails under combat." "Then Rosenthal just killed 200 men with his arrogance." LeMay lit a cigar, his face grim. "And if by some miracle they survive, I'll personally see him busted down to private for disobeying direct orders." At Thorpe Abbotts, Colonel Huglin was informed of the situation. Despite his sinus infection, he immediately went to the operations center and began monitoring radio traffic from the mission. If Rosenthal's formation failed, Huglin knew he'd lose one of his best pilots and 200 men to German fighters. If it succeeded but command followed through with court-martial, he'd lose Rosenthal anyway, to military justice. Either way, when those bombers came home, there would be hell to pay. But what happened over Germany would shock everyone. 9:23 hours, 150 miles inside Germany. The radio crackled. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high, multiple contacts." The Luftwaffe had been waiting. Over 300 German fighters, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine Bf-110s, had been scrambled to intercept the bomber stream. They'd had time to climb to altitude, position themselves, and coordinate their attacks. The massacre began immediately. B-17s from other groups started going down, streaming smoke, spinning out of formation, parachutes blossoming in the sky like deadly flowers. The first attack on Rosenthal's group came at 9:24 hours. 6 FW-190s diving from 12 o'clock high, the classic head-on attack that exploited the B-17's weak nose armament. But the Javelin Formation's staggered depth meant the attacking fighters couldn't line up multiple targets. As they dove through the formation, they found themselves facing coordinated fire from aircraft at different altitudes and positions. The lateral spacing meant gunners had clear fields of fire without friendly aircraft blocking their shots. One FW-190 took hits from 3 different B-17s simultaneously. It rolled inverted and plummeted. Attack 2 came 30 seconds later from 9 o'clock level, a beam attack by 4 BF-109s. In a standard combat box, this would have targeted the vulnerable waist gun positions. But the Javelin's asymmetric positioning meant the German pilots couldn't predict where aircraft would be. Their attacks lost coordination. 2 broke off without firing. Attack 3, Attack 4, Attack 5. The Germans kept coming. Single fighters, pairs, coordinated flights of 6 or 8 aircraft, head-on attacks, stern attacks, diving attacks from above. They tried everything. But the Javelin formation held. The staggered positioning created overlapping fields of fire from unexpected angles. Attacking fighters found themselves taking fire from bombers they hadn't even targeted. The increased lateral spacing meant aircraft could shift positions slightly to cover gaps without breaking formation integrity. When Lieutenant Michael Brennan's bomber took hits in the number 3 engine and started to fall behind, the formation flexed. 2 aircraft dropped back slightly to provide covering fire while Brennan's crew feathered the prop and maintained position on 3 engines. At 9:47 hours, a massive coordinated assault, 12 fighters attacking from multiple angles simultaneously. This was the killing blow the Luftwaffe had perfected. Hit a formation from 4 directions at once, overwhelm the defensive gunners, pick off the bombers one by one. The 95th Bomb Group, flying ahead in standard combat box, lost 4 aircraft in this attack. Rosenthal's group lost none. The Javelin's 3-dimensional defensive matrix meant gunners could engage multiple threats without confusion about sectors of responsibility. The formation absorbed the attack like a boxer rolling with a punch. By the time they reached Regensburg at 10:15 hours, the 100th Bomb Group had survived 19 separate fighter attacks. Rosenthal counted them during the bomb run, 19 distinct engagements with German fighters. Not a single B-17 had gone down. Every aircraft was damaged. Brennan's bomber was flying on 3 engines. Lieutenant Charles Wilson had taken 20 hits in the tail section. Captain Brady's aircraft had a shredded rudder, but they were all still flying, all still in formation. The bombs dropped on target. The formation turned south for the long flight to North Africa. They'd land there rather than risk the return trip over Germany. As they cleared German airspace, Rosenthal allowed himself a moment of relief. His formation had worked. His men were alive. But he also knew that when they landed, his career was probably over. However, the real story was just beginning. August 18, 1943. RAF Teliagma, Algeria. The 100th Bomb Group landed in North Africa after the 14-hour mission from England. Ground crews swarmed the battered B-17s, counting holes, assessing damage. Rosenthal climbed out of his bomber, exhausted. A communications officer was waiting for him with a message flimsy. Major Rosenthal, you're to report immediately by radio telephone to Colonel LeMay at 8th Air Force Headquarters. This was it, the court-martial. Rosenthal keyed up the radio telephone connection. LeMay's voice came through clearly despite the distance. Major Rosenthal, I've been reviewing the mission reports. Yes, sir. Your group flew an unauthorized formation in direct violation of standing tactical doctrine. Yes, sir, I take full responsibility. How many aircraft did you lose? Rosenthal paused. None, sir. All 21 aircraft made it to North Africa. Silence on the line, then say again. 0 losses, sir. We took damage, multiple aircraft with wounded crew members, several flying on 3 engines, but all 21 made it. Another pause. The 95th Bomb Group lost 7 aircraft, the 390th lost 9, the 100th lost none. Yes, sir. And you faced how many fighter attacks? 19 separate engagements, sir. We counted during debriefing. LeMay's voice changed. The anger was gone, replaced by intense interest. Describe this formation you flew. For the next 20 minutes, Rosenthal explained the Javelin formation in detail. The staggered depth positioning, the increased lateral spacing, the flexible defensive zones, the three-dimensional fire coverage. He described how it performed under each type of attack, head-on, beam, diving, coordinated. LeMay listened without interrupting. When Rosenthal finished, the colonel said, "Major, I was preparing to have you court-martialed for disobeying orders." "I understand, sir." "Instead, I'm ordering you to prepare a full tactical briefing on this formation. Every diagram, every defensive arc, every positioning detail. You'll present it to all group commanders when you return to England." Rosenthal was stunned. "Sir." The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission lost 60 aircraft overall, 16% of the force dispatched. Your group lost 0. 0, Major. If what you stumbled onto works that well, every bomber group in 8th Air Force needs to know about it immediately. "Yes, sir, but sir, about the unauthorized." "Major Rosenthal." LeMay's voice was hard but not angry. "In this war, I don't care about regulations. I care about results. Your formation got results. The combat box is getting men killed. Which one do you think I'm going to use?" After the call ended, Captain Brady found Rosenthal sitting on the wing of his bomber. "Well, what did LeMay say?" Rosenthal looked up, still processing. "He wants us to teach everyone how to do it." "No court-martial. No court-martial." Brady laughed. "So you broke every rule in the book, defied direct orders, committed tactical heresy, and you're getting promoted to training command." "Apparently," Rosenthal shook his head. "I thought my career was over instead." "Instead, you just rewrote the tactical manual." Brady clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad for a Brooklyn lawyer." But while LeMay had been converted, not everyone at 8th Air Force Headquarters was convinced. The Javelin Formation would face its most difficult test, not from German fighters, but from the bureaucrats who designed the formations it was replacing. This is where things took a dramatic turn. September 1943, High Wycombe, England, 8th Air Force Headquarters. LeMay's endorsement of the Javelin Formation triggered an immediate bureaucratic firestorm. The Tactical Operations Section, responsible for developing and approving all formation doctrine, viewed Rosenthal's unauthorized innovation as a direct challenge to their authority and expertise. Lieutenant Colonel James Wilson, who'd first spotted the unauthorized formation in reconnaissance photos, led the opposition. He prepared a detailed memorandum listing 23 specific ways the Javelin Formation violated established tactical principles. His conclusion: the formation's success on a single mission is statistically insignificant. Widespread adoption without proper testing would be reckless and dangerous. But LeMay had the mission statistics, and they were impossible to ignore. On August 17, groups flying standard combat box formations averaged 11.2% losses. The 100th Bomb Group, flying Javelin Formation, had 0 losses despite facing the same intensity of attacks. LeMay ordered comparative testing. Over the next 6 weeks, selected squadrons flew Javelin Formation on alternating missions while other squadrons maintained combat box. The test conditions were identical: same targets, same threat levels, same fighter opposition. The results were undeniable. By mid-October, the data showed that squadrons flying Javelin Formation experienced 43% fewer losses than those flying combat box. More significantly, damaged aircraft survival rates improved dramatically. In the flexible Javelin Formation, bombers with engine failures or battle damage could maintain protected positions. In the rigid combat box, they became stragglers and easy prey. Even more impressive were the fighter-kill ratios. German pilots, accustomed to exploiting combat box blind spots, found themselves taking unexpected fire from the Javelin's three-dimensional defensive matrix. Luftwaffe after-action reports, captured later in the war, described the new American formation as unpredictable and significantly more dangerous than previous arrangements. Despite the statistical evidence, institutional resistance remained fierce. The Tactical Operations section argued that the Javelin Formation was too complex, required too much training, and lacked the combat discipline of the geometric combat box. The turning point came on October 14, 1943, the second Schweinfurt raid, remembered as Black Thursday. Of 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down and 17 more were damaged beyond repair, a 26% loss rate that shocked 8th Air Force Command. But the groups that had adopted Javelin Formation variants suffered significantly lower losses. The 100th Bomb Group, now flying Javelin as standard practice, lost 3 aircraft out of 18, a 16% loss rate compared to the overall 26%. 3 days later, LeMay issued Tactical Directive 1743. All heavy bombardment groups in 8th Air Force were authorized to adopt flexible formation tactics based on the Javelin Formation principles. The directive stopped short of mandating the new formation. Wilson and his staff successfully argued for commander discretion, but it broke the combat box's monopoly on tactical doctrine. Rosenthal was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to the 8th Air Force Tactical Development Group. His new job: refine the Javelin formation and develop variants for different tactical situations. Over the winter of 1943-1944, the Javelin evolved. Different groups adapted the core principles to their specific needs and flying styles. The 91st Bomb Group developed a variant optimized for flak-heavy environments, with even wider lateral spacing. The 381st Bomb Group created a modified version for maximum defensive firepower during fighter attacks. The formation that emerged wasn't a single rigid pattern but a flexible tactical philosophy. Staggered depth over geometric precision, defensive coverage over visual symmetry, adaptability over rigid doctrine. By March 1944, when the combined bomber offensive intensified in preparation for D-Day, over 70% of 8th Air Force heavy bombardment groups had abandoned the combat box in favor of Javelin-derived formations. The official tactical manuals were quietly updated. The phrase combat box formation began to disappear from operational orders, replaced by flexible defensive formation and staggered combat pattern. Wilson's Tactical Operations section took credit for the development of these improved tactical doctrines, making no mention of an unauthorized formation flown by a Brooklyn lawyer who decided regulations were less important than saving lives. But the bomber crews knew. They called it Rosie's Revenge, the formation that proved the field commanders knew more about survival than the staff officers with their theories and diagrams. As the war progressed, the Javelin formation would continue to evolve and prove its worth in ways even Rosenthal hadn't anticipated. By late 1944, the Javelin formation's influence extended far beyond the 8th Air Force. When the 15th Air Force began strategic bombing operations from Italy in late 1943, they initially adopted standard combat box formations. Loss rates immediately spiked. Mediterranean-based Luftwaffe units had studied the combat box's weaknesses extensively. In January 1944, Rosenthal was temporarily assigned to brief 15th Air Force Group commanders on Javelin formation principles. The adaptation was immediate and successful. By March 1944, 15th Air Force loss rates had dropped by 38%. The flexible formation proved particularly effective in the Mediterranean theater, where missions often involved longer flight times and sustained fighter opposition. The British Royal Air Force took notice. RAF Bomber Command had relied primarily on night operations, where formations were less critical. But RAF daylight operations, particularly by medium bombers, had suffered similar problems to early American efforts. In April 1944, Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett requested a briefing on the American flexible formation tactics. Rosenthal spent 2 weeks at RAF High Wycombe, adapting Javelin principles for Lancaster and Halifax bombers. The British implementation, designated Distributed Combat Formation, incorporated Javelin's core concepts while accounting for differences in British aircraft and doctrine. But the most profound impact was philosophical rather than tactical. Before the Javelin formation, military aviation doctrine assumed that tactical innovation came from headquarters, from staff officers with time to analyze, test, and formalize procedures. Field commanders implemented doctrine, they didn't create it. Rosenthal's success shattered that assumption. It demonstrated that field commanders, facing actual combat conditions, could develop superior tactics through observation and practical experience. The best tactical innovations came from the people who had to live or die by them. This philosophical shift influenced how the Army Air Forces approached tactical development for the remainder of the war. The Tactical Development Group, which Rosenthal helped establish, included experienced combat pilots and commanders, not just staff officers. Field commanders were actively encouraged to report tactical innovations, and successful field modifications were rapidly disseminated rather than suppressed for violating doctrine. The P-51 Mustang escort tactics that proved so effective in 1944, aggressive forward sweeps rather than close bomber escort, originated with field commanders who'd observed what actually worked in combat. These tactics were quickly adopted because Rosenthal had established the precedent that field innovation was valuable, not insubordinate. When the war ended in May 1945, statistical analysis of 8th Air Force operations told a remarkable story. Between August 1943 and May 1945, bomber groups flying Javelin-derived formations had loss rates averaging 1.7% per mission compared to 2.9% for missions flown in rigid geometric formations during the same period. That 1.2% difference represented approximately 340 heavy bombers and 3,400 aircrewmen, who survived missions they likely wouldn't have survived under old tactical doctrine. Rosenthal himself flew 52 combat missions, double the required tour length, and survived the war. He returned to Brooklyn, resumed his law practice, and rarely spoke about his wartime service. When aviation historians interviewed him in the 1960s, he deflected credit. "I just paid attention to what was actually happening and tried to keep my men alive. Any commander would have done the same." But not every commander had the courage to defy regulations, risk court-martial, and trust their own observations over official doctrine. Post-war, the Javelin Formation's principles became foundational to tactical aviation doctrine worldwide. Looking back across 8 decades, John Rosenthal's illegal formation represents something more significant than a tactical innovation. It represents the triumph of empirical observation over bureaucratic doctrine, of practical experience over theoretical planning, of a commander's responsibility to his men over blind adherence to regulations that weren't working. The official Air Force histories of World War II mention the evolution of flexible bomber formations, in passing, usually crediting the Tactical Operations Section at 8th Air Force Headquarters. Rosenthal's name appears rarely, and when it does, there's no mention of unauthorized formations or threatened court-martials. But the impact is measurable in lives saved. Conservative estimates suggest that adoption of Javelin-derived formations reduced bomber loss rates by 30–40% compared to rigid geometric formations. Over the 18 months from late 1943 to May 1945, this reduction represented approximately 300–400 heavy bombers and 3,400 aircrewmen who survived missions they might not have survived under old doctrine. Beyond raw numbers, Rosenthal's innovation changed how military organizations approach tactical development. The post-war U.S. Air Force institutionalized the principle that effective tactics emerge from combat experience, not just theoretical analysis. The Tactical Air Command, established in 1946, explicitly incorporated combat veterans into doctrine development, a direct legacy of the Javelin Formation's success. Modern military aviation still reflects Rosenthal's core insight. Formations must be flexible enough to adapt to actual combat conditions rather than theoretical threat models. Fighter formations, bomber patterns, even drone swarm tactics incorporate the principle of staggered, flexible positioning over rigid geometry. The Javelin formation itself became obsolete as air warfare evolved. The introduction of effective long-range fighter escorts in 1944 reduced bomber formations' reliance on mutual defensive fire. Jet aircraft and guided missiles in the post-war era made close formation flying less relevant. But the principle survived. Trust field commanders to innovate based on what they observe in actual combat, even when it contradicts official doctrine. Rosenthal died in 2007 at age 89. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned his distinguished war record, but made no mention of the formation that saved hundreds of lives. The military awards he received, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Clusters, recognized his combat service but not his tactical innovation. Yet for 18 months in the skies over Nazi Germany, every bomber crew flying in a flexible, staggered formation owed their survival advantage to a 26-year-old lawyer who decided that saving lives was more important than following regulations he knew were wrong. So there you have it, the complete story of how one commander's illegal Formation stopped 19 attacks and changed tactical aviation forever. From an unauthorized pattern flown over Schweinfurt to standard doctrine across all Allied bomber forces, from threatened court-martial to vindication and adoption, John Rosenthal's Javelin Formation proved that the best tactical innovations come from those who face combat, not those who theorize about it from headquarters. An estimated 3,000 to 4,000 American and Allied aircrewmen survived the war because Rosenthal had the courage to trust his observations over official regulations. The Javelin Formation reduced loss rates by 30–40% and established the principle that field commanders should drive tactical innovation based on actual combat experience. Rosenthal never sought recognition, rarely discussed his wartime innovation, and deflected credit to his crews. But his legacy lives on in every military doctrine that values practical combat experience over theoretical planning, in every tactical manual that encourages field innovation, in every commander who trusts their observations over bureaucratic inertia. What impressed you most about this story of tactical courage? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to see more untold stories of World War II innovation and the men who defied doctrine to save lives, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching WWII Aviation, and I'll see you in the next one.